Hi, everyone. If you're just joining us, welcome to our diversity webinar. It is 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, noon Eastern Time. So we're going to wait just a little bit more for the West Coast morning stragglers here. But thank you for joining us. We're really excited to talk about this topic, this very important topic. Hopefully everyone had a great long weekend. And while we're waiting here, just a quick reminder that, we're going to have this discussion for about probably 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to leave the last 20 minutes for some Q&A. So think about some of the questions that you'd like to ask, and please put them in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring all of those questions and hopefully be able to ask all of them at the end of this discussion. So we've got some more people joining us. We'll wait just a couple more minutes. Hopefully everyone has their coffees, you West Coasters, or something to drink for the East Coasters during lunchtime. John Jeff Hunter, on your second cup of coffee already. Great. This is just my first, so I'll be catching up with you pretty soon. All right, we're just gonna give it one more minute and then we'll get started. We'll dive right in because I know everyone probably has some pretty hectic next couple of days coming off of a long weekend. All right, so it is 9:03 a.m. Pacific time, so we're gonna get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our diversity webinar. My name is Jamie Sarachit, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Communications at Comparably. For those of you who are not familiar with Comparably.com, we're a workplace culture and corporate brand reputation platform. We provide a more transparent, fair, and accurate representation on what it's like to work at thousands of companies. And we do it from the lens of current employees. What I find unique about what we do is we segment all of our insights by gender, race, age, years of experience, education, and more. So that's why it's really thrilling for me to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion today. And we also help companies better tell their employer brand story. So one of the reasons why we're doing this webinar today is because diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives are very important to a thriving business, internally and externally. Really, DE&I makes organizations stronger and more agile. And especially in today's rapidly changing business environment, we all know right now we're going through the era of what people are calling the Great Resignation. So we want all of you who are listening in and viewing today to really walk away from this webinar with new methods to use and actionable best practices in your own organizations. And I am absolutely thrilled today to be joined by Danita Oliver from RingCentral. Her passion for positive change has really led her to become the organization's first senior global DE&I leader in 2021. So Danita, just, I want to talk you up a little bit before we dive in. So I hope you don't mind. I know you're a little bit bashful, but Danita's team drives strategies that really further integrate diversity, equity, inclusion across RingCentral's entire business model and corporate culture. She's really spearheaded many of their initiatives that create diverse thought leadership. Her career in tech spans over 30 years. She started in the finance operations group at IBM before joining RingCentral's finance and tech team in 2018. And her work contributes to RingCentral's A+ culture rating on Comparably, and really a host of other honors. I mean, RingCentral has won multiple Comparably awards for culture, compensation, diversity, happiness, leadership, and women. And Danita has also won Mogul's Top 100 DE&I leaders. So with all of that said, I'm thrilled to be joined by, such an established leader. Danita, welcome. And can you share just a brief sort of timeline of your career and what led you to your role at RingCentral today?
Well, thank you, Jamie. It's good to be here. And thank you for that intro. I'm glad we're recording it because I'll have to play it at family events. You sound really important here. So what led me to this position and a little bit about myself, as you mentioned, 30 years, more than 30 years in the tech space, most of them with IBM. Joined RingCentral in 2018 to start up a team in the Charlotte area, a finance team there. But how I got to DE&I, I would say that in 2020, right after George Floyd's killing, everything just kind of culminated for me. I think I was able to really crystallize all of the years of leading teams and leading people, being invested in people, caring about people's development, with wanting to be effective and have impact in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And so I did something about it. I went and took courses at Cornell, and I got involved in some organizations outside of RingCentral, and I tried to work on honing skills directed at improving just my team at the time. I wasn't even thinking this broadly. And I was leading the Black Employee ERG with a co-chair. I had been doing that since 2018. So all of that together, I think, contributed to me making a decision that in this last part of my career, my swan song, I really wanted it to be impactful. I wanted to be part of making a difference and being the change that I have desired to see for so many years in my career.
I love that. And just want to give a little bit of background too, for those of you who are unfamiliar with RingCentral. RingCentral is a publicly traded company. It's the leading cloud-based communications and collaboration solution for business. So Danita, can you just give a little bit of background on RingCentral in your own words?
Absolutely. I mean, you summed it up, right? We have the best product, best app, all in one app, mobile, video, phone. We have webinar, we have RingCentral Rooms. We also have contact center options that are available for customers from small and medium business all the way up to our enterprise customers. And we are an internationally known company, internationally awarded. And we have strategic partnerships with companies like AT&T and Avaya, all the way to Verizon and Vodafone. So it's an extensive breadth of strategic partnerships along with our product that make us successful.
And how many employees do you have today?
So currently, between all of the geographies, we have roughly over 8,000, approaching 9,000 employees, and that's inclusive of contractors as well as our full-time employees.
Awesome. So let's dive in here. You know, we often tend to think about diversity in a very limited way, right? Only in terms of gender, race, or sexual orientation, but diversity is such a vast topic. And I feel like the usage of the term has really evolved over the last few years. So what do you think? Should we also be defining it to include physical and hidden disabilities? I think I read somewhere the other day that 25% of Americans have a hidden or physical disability. So should we be thinking about sort of diversity of background and perspectives in terms of thinking style as well?
Absolutely. I mean, diversity is a vast topic, right? It's not just what I think people previously thought, and some people still do, gender and ethnicity or gender and race. There are so many things that make up the characteristics of a person, so much intersectionality. And if I take myself, Jamie, as an example, I am an African-American woman who happens to be a college-educated African-American woman. I happen to be an HBCU graduate. So all of that plays into the diversity or how I think and perceive. Additionally, I'm the mother to a special needs child. I am caring for my parents in a multi-generational household. So that it impacts my thoughts and how I perceive things, right? And so then you've got all of my life experiences for the sum of, we won't even go into that number, those many years that I bring to the table when I'm having conversation about whatever it is, because it's those things are shaping my perspective, my experiences. Additionally, if there's a disability involved. So recently I found out that having had a knee replacement and, that's considered a disability. So I mean, diabetes is considered a disability. There are things that people don't necessarily talk about at work that are disabilities, but they're bringing that with them to the table as they weigh into business decisions, as they help strategize for business. So every bit of that is a part of the diversity that makes up us as a person, right? They're all our characteristics and attributes. And I think we have to broaden how we look at that, but some of that has to be taught. Because what we've always seen as diversity is, well, you know, a Black person or a Latina person or LGBTQ, and we just limited it to those areas. And I think we all have to broaden it. And I think it will continue to evolve as we evolve as a society.
I think that's great. And I think, what I want to dive into a little bit too is, not just sort of the term diversity, but equity and inclusion. And there's a new term, that surfaced over the last couple of years, which is belonging. And I think, right, when we think about equity, to me, it's giving everyone access to the same opportunity, whether that be promotions, raises. I'm very much passionate about pay parity. I've written articles on it, retention, and then inclusion is really feeling valued and being heard, right? But then there's that sort of belonging part. So I kind of want to get your take on the belonging part of it. In my mind, that's really about safety and security and sort of creating, especially in the workplace, right? Creating a space where your employees are feeling like they're accepted and that they can bring their true selves to work. What are your thoughts on that, Danita?
So that's culture, and culture has to be cultivated. It has to be nurtured, and it evolves. And I think every one of those components, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are crucial to belonging, right? And so you appreciate the diversity of who I am and the characteristics and attributes that I bring to the table. And just like you said, you create equitable opportunities for me to reach the fullest potential that I bring to the table, which is not the same potential as the person sitting to my right or to my left. We all have different potentials. And I learned that being a mom to a special needs child. It taught me so much about empowering her to reach her potential, as opposed to letting other people label what her potential is and limit her. And so that's how you lead people, and you bring that and you infuse that into the culture, so to speak, Jamie. So you've got that diversity piece of people's characteristics and attributes, right? And then you have the equity piece, which is not the same as equality. Equality assumes that we all start at the same place, and we do not. But you have that equity component in there. And then you bring the inclusion component. And inclusion is that you do feel heard, you feel that you are valued, you feel your worth is appreciated. You feel that your contributions are necessary to the conversation and to driving the needle forward. And I think it is the combination of those three ingredients that creates belonging culture, right? So I belong to many things. I belong to my sorority. I belong to my College Alumni Association. I belong to different groups and organizations outside of RingCentral and inside of RingCentral. But I don't necessarily experience belonging at every one of those or in every one of those group settings. And by that, I mean, we often think that if we have diverse people on our teams or in our organization, that we're appreciating diversity. But if you don't give them a voice, if you don't empower them to speak however they're comfortable with bringing their part to the table, then you're really not being inclusive. That's where they experience that belonging. I feel like I belong when I get together with my family for every single holiday. There's a meal. I mean, even the Super Bowl, there's a meal, and we're all together being loud and just having a great time laughing and teasing and jovial, right? But then there's dysfunction in my family, but it doesn't mean that I don't belong in that dysfunction. I've learned how to operate in it, right? Because we all are different individuals, but I belong there. And there's something I feel when I'm home. That's the type of culture we have to learn how to cultivate at work, where people feel comfortable to let down and be exactly who they are. I can do that with my family. I want to be able to do that at work. And I can appreciate that employees want to be able to do that on their teams and in the work environment.
I love that. And, I want to say that, we do a lot of surveys on comparably.com where we ask users a lot of questions. And in one of our most recent Comparably surveys, we asked our users, how important is it to work at a company committed to diversity, equity, inclusion? And over 51% said it's extremely important, which was like really the top option as an answer. So, we all know that diversity is important within the workplace, but oftentimes it can be difficult to start, right? Whether you're at a small organization, an SMB. So how do you build that D&I culture in workplaces that maybe have not necessarily had that?
So, great question.
Loaded question, I know.
Well, I think we're in a new place with DE&I. I think there are companies that had a pulse on it at some level. They were monitoring demographics, right? And looking at data metrics to see what they had, but were they doing things about it? How were they effectively driving change? And I think the day that we find ourselves in and the momentum that's here, we can make a difference about things. But I have a tendency, I don't know that this works for everyone, but here, because I feel like I belong, I'm experiencing belonging, and my voice is welcomed, and my opinions and my thoughts are welcomed at the table. I get to bring that creative side and think about things creatively. So because I've been around a long time, I'm often thinking about how do we have impact in that area? For example, how do we bring in Latinx or HBCU students into our entry-level programs and provide an equitable opportunity for them to succeed. And so you start to think through how to create those programs, which is one part of it. But I think the other arm of that, Jamie, is, relationship. You have to go out to these organizations and start to build relationships and partnerships and understand what their needs are. What are they trying to address in their communities? How do their students or members thrive? And what you can do to link that to what your goals are as a company as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think what's helped here so far in the short time that I've been here is that I've been given this nascent space to create and to come up with solutions that other companies are doing, but we're all just doing it differently. What works for RingCentral as a tech company is different over at Morgan Stanley, which is a finance company. But we all have components of the same thing working within our companies, right? We have finance as a part of tech, and finance has tech as a part of what they do. So, broadening your perspective, coming up with creative ideas, and looking at ways to have significant impact that is going to be effective for the people that you want to bring in. And I would add to that, Jamie, creating the culture. So there's like a concurrent thing that has to happen. You can bring all of the diverse representation in that you want, but if you don't have a place, a culture that welcomes people into that space, that makes people feel like they're a part of it, then you defeat your purpose, right? Because they won't stay. So it's at the time that you're inviting people over for dinner, you have to be cleaning up the house to make sure that they're going to feel comfortable staying for dinner. And so I think you have to put internal programs in place as well that support the people, that gives them voice and makes them feel appreciated and understood.
I love that. And I want to sort of dive into, some of the best practices and programs that RingCentral has done so well. But before we get into that, what advice would you give to others on how to respond to sort of the naysayers who control the purse strings, right? Because, a lot of us know that having a diverse workforce has a positive impact on business, really makes the company more innovative, even financially successful, because teams are more cohesive and they perform better. But for those who may not have D&I teams, may not even have a big HR or talent acquisition team, what are some things that you think people can do in their own organizations to try to level up and bring that culture and bring more diversity into their own organizations?
Well, I think organizations, particularly if they have employee resource groups, sometimes they're called affinity groups, business resource groups, I've heard them called many different terms. That's a great source for bringing people into the company, right? If you have jobs open, I get to share it with my network, and in RingCentral, a couple of hundred people get to share it with their network if they're part of the Black employee group, if they're part of our women's group called Sassy, they get to share it with 400 people. I think Black Lives Matter, or the Black employees at RingCentral, we have over 500 people. So and then how many people do they know, right?
Right.
So that's one way that you can bring diversity in, but there's always going to be naysayers, Jamie. You're always going to have people that are against this. They'll see it as another form of affirmative action, which it is not. It is a program, or it is a necessary component of business, because DE&I needs to be infused at every level of business. This isn't just about hiring more women and more people of color. This is about diversity of thought. This is about creating best product. I mean, look at YouTube way back when they started, and I've used this example multiple times, way back when they started the video upload. All of their engineers that worked on that product and the designers were right-handed. So once they launched it and everyone tried to load their videos that was left-handed, they loaded upside down. And so they had to go back. There was money lost. They had to reiterate their program, their product, and make it so that it helped or it worked for left-handed users. That's just a small example. There are so many examples of why DE&I is necessary, because it gives you that different perspective. You know, what I need as an employee with a disability is not what a visually impaired person would need. So naysayers, I think in this day, have to be open to the fact that, number one, that representation on their team gives them a different perspective that they don't bring to the table, because we're all biased. I'm biased. Everyone has biases, right? And so and blind spots. I'd rather call them blind spots. We all have them. And so I think it's just an acknowledgement of that. But a lot of that, Jamie, is done in conversation, because this is really hard work. It's not something that you can just go put data metrics to. I mean, you know, the data is important. I get it. But behind every single data point is a person. And there's a person who has an experience that matters and it counts. And so you can't just look at numbers. You have to be aware that the people make up the numbers. But the naysayers are going to be there. I don't give up. You know, I just keep having conversation. And I try to have conversation by being an active listener, because I think when you hear where people are, it enables you, or it empowers you to meet them where they are, as opposed to me going in and trying to make everybody line up with the way I think. I try to find out how they think. I look for the common ground, and then I try to build from those places and find ways to bring us together in a cohesive way.
I love that. And, you know, hearing you talk about this really reminds me of that quote, you know, be the change you want to see. And I think that, you know, for folks who are in organizations that maybe have those naysayers, and there will be those, as you mentioned, you know, in every organization and sometimes at every level, I think, you know, the onus, I think, is on each individual to be that change. So I love what you said there. Talking about bias, you know, are there ways that you think that we can remove bias or even unconscious bias from our hiring processes? For example, you know, getting rid of this preconceived notion that the best workers come from Ivy League schools. You know, how can we sort of get rid of that bias that can oftentimes creep in to hiring?
Well, the first thing you have to do is recognize that you can't get rid of it. It's the way our brains work, right? I am the least technical person. I tell everyone. I think I told you that before we started this call, but I do understand how our brains are computers. So they're always processing and taking in information, right? And so it literally has to find shortcuts to process that information, and it creates bias. And so because it does, you acknowledge that you have bias or blind spots. And then I think once you can be brave enough or courageous enough to acknowledge it, that it's not an indictment, It's not an accusation. It's not calling you racist. It's just admitting that there are experiences that I don't have. Before we started the call, I was talking to Abby. She lives in Iowa, and she's telling me about how cold it is. It's like a frozen tundra, and I'm in Charleston going, it's going to be like in the 80s this week. I don't have that experience of Iowa. I don't have that. So she brought a different awareness to me, and something that I now have to consider. And that's all it is, And so I think if we stop, if people wouldn't think that it's something that's trying to be, that we're trying to shove down your throats, that we're just trying to broaden the way that we all process. And then because we know we process with bias, so then now I have a voice in my head. Well, there's several, but there's this bias voice that goes, okay, stop. You need to really actively listen and get over your bias, right? And so because I had an experience, or all because I assumed something, or I heard something in the media. There's many factors that play into our biases. So it's not something that you'll ever, I don't think, get rid of. Now, how do you change it in the hiring process? How do you change it in recruiting? I think education is a big part of that. I think teaching people how to be inclusive, teaching them about their bias. We can't just have that once a year compliance course that you check the box and say, thank God that's over. And then move on to the next thing for 364 days until it comes around again. There has to be, I think, some mindfulness in this and thought put into how we teach our people leaders to inclusively lead, how we teach them to appreciate diversity, and how we make them aware of bias so that they can acknowledge it and then work through ways to compensate for that bias. In other words, how to get over it so that you don't have it. But I think, Jamie, for people to think that we can totally eradicate it, I don't think that is a fair assessment or thought process, I should say.
So my next question then is, I'm sure you've heard of the blind resume. I love the concept in theory, right? Where there's no name attached to a resume. It's truly based on just someone's experience. But is that a good strategy to have that could work for some organizations? Maybe not all, but maybe some?
It depends. Yeah, I think it does work for some. I think it makes that beginning part of the recruiting and sourcing process as you're looking for qualified candidates. I think it makes it a little bit more equitable. However, at the end of the day, the majority of hiring managers are not visually impaired. And so there's an interaction that happens with the person that they're hiring, and that bias is going to come into play in there. Now, if they're educated ahead of time, if you're working to continue that education and refresh that education, and they are aware of it, well, then you have an opportunity to choose something different and drive the needle forward that way. But I don't think that blind resumes or blind interviews are the only answer. I think they're part of the answer. I don't think that they're the entire answer. And it's going to be different for every organization because of how the culture is. If the culture is very receiving of, we need to do something different, we want to be better, and your senior leadership is, word and deed, and they're showing you this is what they want, then that whole thing that we've always said about things coming downhill, it's the same for DE&I. When the leaders at the top say it, then it's going to trickle its way down to your entry-level leadership, as well as your employees. You can't just teach leaders this whole process. You have to make sure it's infused for every employee. So there literally has to be a top-down, at least this is my opinion. I believe in a top-down as well as a grassroots effort so that it meets in the middle. Because if you start at the top, it never really gets all the way to the bottom, and you can't expect the bottom to drive it up to the top, right? So there has to be that fusion that happens because you're working it from both sides.
The biggest controversy, I think, right now about hiring for D&I is that, people say companies are hiring based on just checking off a box. It's not based on merit. You've heard some leaders say, we can't find this particular skill or person who has this experience or this specific talent pool. So really, we can't be diverse in our hiring because they're just not there. And that's simply not true, right? So how would you sort of go about answering that?
We're the company for that, right? Because we provide a product that allows or enables customers to work from anywhere, not just home, anywhere. And the pandemic, if it's not shown us anything else, it's shown us that we are agile and we can work from remote places effectively, producing great results. So that said, I think what we have to do is change our mindset, right? So it used to be years ago, before some people were born, that HR went out and looked for people, or it was HR, it wasn't talent acquisition back then. HR did the whole thing. And they looked for people in the area where the office was located. Even if it was a global company, you looked in a specific demographic that was centric to the office, right? So 50-mile radius to the office, because you don't want people to have a long commute. I'm from the Northeast, so I'm thinking that from years ago. Now, with these tools that we have today, and even before now, but more so now, you get to go out and find people anywhere, right? Because you have a product that enables them to work anywhere. Now, not every job is a work from home job. I get it. But for those that are, then we should expand our reach. And we should be looking in the places where the people are located, as opposed to expecting the people to be in the places where we're located. So I think it's just a shift in how we look at things. And then expanding where we look, right? And so typically what you'll hear, and at least as I circle the DEI space, Jamie, I hear people talking about, oh, we need to recruit from HBCUs. Well, we did a program for that. And we need to do HSIs, Hispanically Serving Institutions. We did one for that. And veterans and people with disabilities. And that's all great, but you can't bring all those people in entry-level roles either, right? You've got to be able to expand your search to look for people in the mid and the senior level roles, because representation matters. And I think you asked me something earlier. I want to kind of go back to it if you don't mind. You asked me about when people think if you're not from an Ivy League school, you're not good. I think that is such a sad way to look at things, but that's an example of bias, right? Because you think that we only want the MIT graduate, the Harvard, the Yale, the Princeton graduates, and we want the top 10. Well, I can guarantee you the top 10 Latino, the top 10 African-American, Native American, and LGBTQ engineers that graduated from those schools, they are getting paid top dollar, like by NASA and Tesla, because so you got to be prepared for that if that's who you're going after, because everybody's going after them. But that doesn't negate these smaller schools. I went to a small school, and that the experience at my small HBCU, Jamie, phenomenal. You know why? 2,500 students way back when, and it's way more now. But 2,500 students meant that my classrooms were no more than 20, 30 students. And every one of my professors and doctors that taught me knew me. So when I gave them work that wasn't quality or that wasn't up to my potential, talk about equity and diversity, equity, and they sent me back. I remember one professor, he said, okay, Ms. Rux, well, your chance of getting an A is off the table, but you can take this back because this is not your best work. So I had to go back and rework it. And it was that one-on-one, that hands-on, that making sure you brought your best every day, that pushed us, right? We thrived on it. And so if I was getting it all the way back then, how much more these schools have grown and improved their programs. But they've always had good programs. When they had to create HBCU programs, it was because they couldn't get into those schools. So they had to be on the same level and caliber. They just weren't at the Harvards and the Yales. And HBCUs, HSIs, they produce some of the best engineers, the best marketing people, the best finance people, because it takes every single discipline that you can think of just about to run a company. And they all come from those schools. So I just wanted to go back and address that because you asked, and I didn't want to leave that on the table.
No, I appreciate that because, I went to a public, college, university as well. And where I got my experience was through internships, So a lot of my school was like theory based, but internships are super important. Experience is really important. And I think some of the best hires that I've made on my own teams, have come from non-Ivy League schools. So I think that's important to say as well. So thank you for bringing that back up. So obviously we're talking a little bit about, going to where people are, not necessarily just, going to a lot of these job boards and calling it a day, right? So can you talk a little bit more about your LEAD program?
The HBCU Lead Academy? Yeah, that's our HBCU LEAD, and LEAD stands for Leveling Equality, Advancing Diversity. So what we're doing there is an early investment in interns. Currently, our interns are typically seniors and above, like we'll have grad students as well. But for the HBCU LEAD program, what we wanted to do was find junior year students and bring them in for an internship, a 12-week program. And in whatever their career aspirations or their area of study is it finance, is it marketing, is it, cybersecurity, whatever it is, let's bring them in for 12 weeks and let's stand them up and support them. Not only are we going to give them a project and work to do within that organization, because it's not just somebody that comes in to file papers, we're bringing them in to contribute to the business. We're bringing them in so that we can help groom them, help teach them areas where they may need like a refresher on their resume or working on their presentation skills. And then let's bring them back their senior year, because we already know what they're capable of. And in their senior year, they do even more and they contribute more to the program. And then we can hire them. And the way HBCU LEAD works is that our Black Employee Resource Group has a program called Black Bold Leadership. And so they bring in speakers, and we're talking like, heavy hitters like Carla Harris from Morgan Stanley. We've had Diane Billings-Buford from the RISE organization for sports equality. So they're involved right now, deeply involved with the NFL. We've had Craig Samuels, who's an entrepreneur with restaurants. And then recently, I know I'm going to get her last name mixed up. It's either Jennifer Austin Jones or Jennifer Jones Austin, but she leads an organization for social justice and reform. So we bring in these speakers to talk about their career journeys and things that our students, as well as we have an apprenticeship program, and our apprentices can be doing and considering in their career. Then we have them partnered with 2 mentors in the Black Employee Resource Group, as well as partnered with mentors within the organization that they work in. So we put all of these helps in place to ensure their success. It's not just about, it's not enough, I don't think, to bring people in. And Jamie, I was one of the people that just got brought in, but I had parents that gave me a conscious awareness. I had parents that pushed me and made me aware of some things that, because I'm a 4th generation graduate from my HBCU, they made me aware of things that everybody doesn't necessarily get. So we want to make sure that we're giving exactly what people need so that they can be successful. And that's how our program works. And then after we hire them, then the whole goal of giving back, right? Kind of that corporate social responsibility, where we do an endowment or a scholarship endowment at each HBCU that we align with and bring these students in. They go through the same internship program as our ringturns. They just start a year earlier.
I love that, your ringturns. I love that. And I love what you're saying, because, sometimes it can feel, a little difficult to feel connected to your workplace or have an affinity to a company if you look around and you really don't see anybody that looks like you, or you don't have anybody that you can speak to within your company who represents, your particular group. And oftentimes I think that can, cause a disconnect, right, for the employees towards their workplace. So, I feel like we need to ensure that there's diversity in terms of like the board, senior leadership, mid-level managers, that really there's diversity at every level of the organization. So what are your thoughts in terms of once you bring in those diverse candidates, the listening part, right? The learning part. I know you guys have a really great program on that. Can you just tell everyone a little bit about your listening program?
Oh, the listening and healing room.
Yes.
So yeah, So the Listening and Healing Room, we launched last year. I partnered with our wellness leader, Ellen Christie, who, takes care of all of our everything from health, wellness seminars and things that we focus on there. And I talked with her and I just started building this relationship with her. And I said, listen, I want to do something. How do what do you think about we offer employees a space, a safe space where they can come share. You don't have to, it's totally volunteer, but you can share about your experiences from your perspective if you feel vulnerable enough and safe enough. And then people can listen, they can ask questions, but it will, number one, foster understanding, and number two, foster allyship, right? Because there are things that people go through that you may not necessarily know when they're sitting at a conference table in a meeting, or you're on a video meeting. You might not know what that person's struggling with. You might not know when I'm sitting in a meeting that my father's downstairs with, visiting nurses and things of that nature. And I know he's in pain and I'm having to listen to that, but still show up 100% at work. And I think it gives a greater appreciation. It connects us, right? It brings the humanity. It humanizes each one of us as we work together, because you realize, wow, I had no idea Jamie was going through all of that. She doesn't talk about that. And not to make you talk about it, but now you brought something that I've got to consider as part of your diverse attributes and characteristics. You brought something to the table. So we do these listening and healing rooms, and we've had great responses and feedback. We've had amazing participants. We've had parents of transgender children. We've had people in the LGBTQ community. We've had Black employees, Asian employees during the Asian hate, when it was really heightened, and it hasn't ended, but when it was heightened, and they were sharing, and it's very moving, and it's humbling to be a part of those spaces where people are so willing to be transparent about what their experiences are. And even when I think about, not all African Americans had the same experience growing up. So then when I hear other people's, I'm like, number one, appreciative of mine, but then it makes me appreciate theirs even more, because they've overcome some things, they've endured some things to get where they are. So our Listening and Healing Room series did really well last year. And this year, Jamie, we plan on taking it to the next level. It's a continuum. And we're going to do what's called common ground. So now we're going to find those places of commonality, because we're all different, yet we're the same. We're so much more the same than we are different, but finding places of commonality where we can, bridge the gap and build bridges and start to build upon those things. So it's not just about people coming together, talking about what makes us different. It's coming together and figuring out where we're alike and how that connective tissue can become a living thing that creates our organization and our culture here at RingCentral.
I love that. Are there any other ways that you think, you can help promote some of your diverse employee voices so that they can feel heard?
So our ERGs are very active. And one of the things that we're looking at doing this year is empowering their voice, right? Helping them to really fine tune what they're passionate about, what they want to drive as far as their mission as an ERG is drive into the business, as well as talk about with our CXO leaders. So we are trying to raise up our diversity advisory council to the C-suite. And hopefully we can get that off the ground this year, where our ERGs, our leaders, are talking to their members are sharing and expressing what's important to them. They are, specifying what things they want to bring forward. We have 11 ERGs. Each ERG is figuring out what's common. If the common thing is we all need more women, which we do, everybody does, but we need women of different ethnicities. Well, every group shouldn't be going up talking about that. We know we need to hire women, and we'd like to see the company hit these numbers by such and such a date. So empowering them to find their voice and then giving them a way to get that voice to the people that can make a difference is one of the things that we're doing. And I think, or we're looking at doing, and I think it will be very productive for us. It'll be a viable source for our leaders to be able to really hear more so than just the surveys, but hear people say it. Additionally, we have an event called Gatherings, where our CXO leaders do meet randomly on roundtable sessions with employees. So that's another way that employees get an opportunity to share. It's a small group setting. It's usually a leader and maybe 4 or 5 other employees. And they get to ask and talk about anything that they want. So I think it's about finding different ways to communicate and give people a voice to be able to express themselves and feel heard.
Awesome. And just before we dive into some of our audience questions, I want to remind everyone we are going to save, the latter half of this conversation for your questions. So please do put in your questions in our Q&A box. We do have someone on my team monitoring those questions, and we'll get right to it. But just have 2 more questions before we get into those. Really, in light of the pandemic and the social justice issues that we've had over the past few years, I think job seekers and employees really want to align with companies and leaders who support their communities. We want to show more empathy. We want to show that we have more emotional IQ. What can companies do to be allies? Because you guys have done such an amazing job of doing that. You have a great culture. So I think a lot of the audience members want to learn from you and hopefully emulate what you have done. But what are some things that you've done that, you can share with folks?
Well, I mean, when George Floyd was murdered, I mean, the Black employees felt exceptionally supported by the leadership at the time in their declaration, and still do in their declaration toward what an injustice this was. And then even as all of the trials played out, the Breonna Taylor trial, George Floyd's trial, and then Ahmaud Arbery, I mean, just the level of support that we received in our ERG group, as well as outside of it, our employees, Black employees talked about it. But there are other issues, right? Asian hate that happened, and the horrific things that happened to Asian people across this country. There's so many issues that can be advocated for. But the way that I think it starts, Jamie, is that you have to have representation within the company that looks like the communities that you're operating in. Because I don't know the Asian community, just like somebody else won't know the Black community, just like somebody else, I don't know the Latino community, right? Because it's not my experience. Now, it doesn't mean I can't learn about it. It doesn't mean that I can't be effective there, but who better to be effective than the people that know the community? And if this is where our customers are, then who better to lead us into those spaces and places than people that represent those communities? So this is why, to me, it's important that diversity, equity, and inclusion is infused into the company culture, the company business strategy, everything we do. It's like, I liken it to seasoning a great meal, right? You set it out in front of your guests, they eat it, and they're like, oh my gosh, that tastes wonderful. But nobody sets all the spices out that you put into the dish. That's what DE&I is, right? It's that spice in the dish that makes the dish great. And that's what it should be here. But that's when you have the representation from all of those areas that you serve. And we're global, right? So what DEI means in the US is not what it means in EMEA. It's not what it means in Israel or in Australia, in Germany, in Manila. It means something totally different in China. So it's different by location. And you have to make sure you take that into consideration when you're building out this program, because the needs here aren't necessarily the needs there. But getting that representation in those areas so that they in turn can go back out into their communities and to your customer base who are in those communities, then it will make a difference.
I think that's a great point. Let's get into some of the questions that we have. Someone asked, how does one begin this work at their own company? Do we start with a survey?
That's a great way to start. If I just had a conversation last week with a small company of 150 people that was looking for some ideas on how to start. So yes, get a pulse on where your employees are. Because there are going to be gaps. Every company has gaps. Even companies that are doing this the best there's gaps. So you're always trying to get that pulse, right? We conducted a survey last year. We'll do it annually. In addition, we plan to stand up some focus groups because that's a good way to get feedback as well. But talk to people and find out what their needs are. Don't just think you know or assume that you know what the needs are and where the gaps are. I was really surprised at the tremendous amount of positive comments we got back from our surveys, and where employees felt we were doing well. And then I was even surprised by some of the places that they felt we weren't doing well. But in the end of the day, what it did for me is it made me informed. And then it helped me to strategize on how to structure programs and how we prioritize, because what I went into this thinking the priority is not how I left after we got the survey results back.
Another person asked, where's the best resource for DE&I industry standards? For example, language to use for gender choice on an application, resources for companies, best practices, etc.
Yeah. So I would say there's so many resources out there, right? The Society of Human Resource Management, SHRM, is a good one. But if you have a legal arm in your business, your chief compliance officers, your employment lawyers, they are really where you should go for writing policy, I think, because you want to make sure that policy is in line with your company's strategy, your purpose, what your company declares outwardly. So you could go get generic practices and policies, but they may have to be tweaked a little bit to fit your organization. And so even if you do go the generic route, I would recommend still always running it by your legal arm, because you want to mitigate any risk about what you declare. And oftentimes, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the legal jargon. So I rely on my partners in legal to guide me when I look up practices and policies that I would like to recommend for other organizations.
And we have another question here asking, are employee communities a good solution for small and mid-sized companies? Are there other options that maybe work well for companies in the small to mid-size range?
Well, I don't know that I'm an expert in that, because I've been with, this is as mid-size as I've been in my career. I mean, I come from the behemoth IBM. So here at RingCentral, this is like small and mid-size for me, in my experience. But I think employee groups work across the board, right? Because they have that experience, right? Your Latinx employees know what it's like to be Latinx in corporate America. So who better to ask than them? You start there. And I think having that group, whether it's 3 people or 30 people, it brings you all are going to find what you have in common. You're going to find what matters to you as a group. And then you can bring that forward as a collective voice.
Absolutely. And I concur with that. Early on in the Comparably journey, when we first started, we started our own women's employee resource group. And to this day, it's grown as we've grown and hired more women. And really, we meet, once a month. And it's just an opportunity for us to gather and to share thoughts and experiences. And it's a wonderful way to have a collective community. So you really can do it from, a small company, like, 50 people up until, 8,000, like you said, Danita. I have another question that came through. Do your senior leaders participate in the listening and healing rooms, or how is that information shared with the top for organizations to take action from what they've learned in those listening rooms?
So keep in mind, the listening rooms are individual people across the company, regardless of level, job title, you can come share. And we've had the whole gamut, first and foremost. And then secondly, we record them. So RingCentral's product is, it enables all of this. We're really in a unique position, right? Because we have a product that fuels our webinars, it fuels our panel discussions. It enables us, like for Black History Month, they've created an archive and a repository all within our product, and it stays within our company. It's not somebody else's product. And so we record every session. You can go back, we disperse it within the ERGs, we disperse it via our webpage where we house it. When we let everyone know that they can access it, and people go back and visit it later if they're unable to attend the live session. So we just make it accessible is what we do. But we were talking about this in another meeting, and how fortunate we are that it's our product, our tools that help us really be effective in this space.
I love that. Another question that came through, the bottom is driving the DNI initiative. How do we get the top to meet us in the middle?
They've got to commit to it, and you've got to have that conversation. If you don't have a dedicated DE&I leader, you need one. If your chief human resource officer or chief people officer hears what ours is, she's all for it, and she's very supportive of it. And so she helps lead that conversation with her peers. But the commitment has to be there. And I think the companies and organizations that struggle the most is when the senior leadership doesn't commit to DE&I. They don't make room for it, and they don't make space for it. But be patient also, because it's not an overnight fix, right? This is not a destination. This is a journey. DE&I will always be happening. So the one thing you have to not think of is, well, we've got to get to 50% women and 50% men, and everybody needs to be making the same thing. And we want to do all of that by next year. You're not going to turn the needle that fast anywhere, even in a small company, because you've got to get people's thought process or thought leadership and mindsets to all go in the same direction. So it takes some time, but little wins. I say, if you're starting up a program, put things in place that enable you to have small wins. Don't try to win the whole, someone told me that years ago, Danita, pick your battle. You want to win the war, but don't go out trying to win the whole war on the first one. Try to win it a battle at a time. And I think as you do that, then you have something that you can build upon, and you can present to these leaders like, look, this is working. You all need to pay attention to this. We need more funding or resources for this. We need to hire a staff to drive this throughout the company. So it just depends on the company culture and what your leaders think. But I think more and more leaders are embracing DE&I. They don't have a choice. By 2025, millennials will be in that leadership. And so their thought process is already in that direction. They're already driving ESG initiatives and DE&I and corporate social responsibility in companies anyway, and as investors and stakeholders and stockholders. So companies are going to have to consider it.
Absolutely. And I think, to add to that, sort of the small wins that you were talking about, someone asked, we've done a D&I belonging survey, but I'm interested in hearing, is there any benchmark we can use when analyzing the result to see how we are in comparison to a market benchmark?
Well, yeah, you've got to see what your competitors are doing, right? Because number one, you're going to find people that are doing it better. And then you want to find out what they're doing that works, right? And then you're going to find people that aren't doing it as well as you are. And I think that establishing those benchmarks is critical to being successful in the organization. But you first have to establish your baseline even within your own organization. That's why that survey, I think that was one of the original questions or initial questions. That survey is so important, because then you get to find out where people are, and then look at your workforce composition. How many women in leadership? How many people of color? How many people with disabilities? How many veterans? Do we have programs for these people with these different diverse characteristics? And putting those programs in place like we did a program last year, pilot program called Transition into Tech, to allow people who were making mid-career shifts. So someone was a registered nurse and decided to go into product design or UX UI. Someone else was a dance instructor and a school teacher and decided to go into cybersecurity. And so we made a way for them to apprentice with the company. We invested in them, and then we were eventually able to hire all three. So now we want to expand that to, can we do this with veterans? Can we do this with the spouses of people who are deployed? Right? Can we do this with people with disabilities, and bring more diverse thought into the company?
I love that, because I really think there's a difference between bringing someone, diverse into the organization, and then there's another thing, right, in terms of how long that individual stays within your organization, how they feel while they're working there, and really, even if they choose to exit right in this great resignation era, are they exiting under favorable conditions where they feel like they've given, their best to the company, the best of themselves, and now maybe it's time to move on to a new venture. So one of the last questions, I have is, you guys have done such an amazing job with your culture. What are some ways that you have shared that externally and internally?
So that's where we are now. That's a great question, but it's where we are now, right? I just wrapped up the assessment. We did the survey in November. I went through and I really dug into where we were as a company, where we need to make improvements. But and I hate using the term, Jamie, we know it from our backgrounds, right? Spin, but it's about how everything can't be negative. It just can't be, well, we're not doing this and we need to fix that and we need to do that. I think I'm most encouraged, even when I've gotten constructive criticism throughout my career, I always did well with managers who found the things that I did well and presented them to me and then talked about where I needed to make improvement, as opposed to the managers that came in and said, oh, you really messed that up, and couldn't think of one thing I did well, but could only focus on the thing that I didn't do well. I think it's the same with business, right? You find that balance. What are the things that we're doing well? And you talk to your senior leaders and you say, look, we're doing this well. Now, because you're doing it well, doesn't mean you stop doing it. It means you got to improve on it. But then we're lacking here. And I think we might want to focus in these two areas right now. We know what we need to do to stand this up. So let's provide some resources to keep that going. We can improve upon that, but we really need to dig in, and we need to hire more women. We need to hire more people of color. We need to focus on, VP level and up, or pick something, right? So right now, that's what I did, Jamie. I just wrapped that up, and now we've got to kind of take that forward so that we can start publishing it externally and internally, right? Because we owe it to our employees and we owe it to our stakeholders. But more than anything, it holds us accountable because now people know, right? And so now that should be our motivating factor. But I'm not in a place where I'm like, wow, these numbers don't look good, so let's wait until they get good and then we'll publish them. Just own it, right? Embrace it. We all are at the beginning of this journey. Starting in different places, but we're all starting a new kind of a DEI journey together. So don't be afraid to start it.
Absolutely. I think that's really a great segue into our conclusion of this webinar. We've gone a couple minutes over, but gosh, there's probably 10 to 12 more questions that we have for you, but we can't get to all of them. So everyone, thank you so much for joining this webinar. It's such an important topic. And as Danita mentioned, it's a work in progress, right? We all need to come together. We all need to level up and learn and listen. And this recording will be provided. There's a copy of it, and we'll send it out to all of you who wants it. And I just want to thank you, Danita, for all of your time, your wisdom, your insights. We so much appreciate it. And for all of those of you who are listening in, we will be doing more of these webinars on a monthly basis. So tune in, follow Comparably on LinkedIn and Twitter. We'll be updating those social media platforms with the next webinar that we plan to do. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.